The earliest records of the St. Louis Mafia are of the Italian mafia gangs in the mid-1890s. By the early 1910s, Dominic Giambrone was recognized as the local mafia boss until 1924, when he stepped down and fled the city. With the passage of Prohibition in 1920, control of St. Louis's illegal bootlegging operations became a major power struggle between the 7 different ethnic gangs: the Green Ones, the Pillow Gang, the Russo Gang, the Egens Rats, the Hogan Gang, the Shelton Gang, and the Cuckoos, all fighting to control illegal rackets in the St. Louis area. The Green Ones was a Sicilian gang formed in 1915 by Vito Ginola, his brother John Ginola, and Alphonse Palazzola before immigrating to America. After the 3 men arrived in America, they went their separate ways. Vito Ginola to St. Louis, John Ginola to Chicago, and Alphonse Palazzola to Springfield, Illinois. During the early 1920s, Vito Gianola reunited with his brother, John Ginola, and Alphonse Palazzola in St. Louis. The 3 men imposed a tax on all goods sold in the city's Italian community. In 1924, Vito Ginola became the most powerful mafia boss in St. Louis, forcing Dominic Giambrone to flee the city. Gianola attempted to take control of the bootlegging rackets in the area and fought with members of the Egens Rats gang and Cuckoos gang. On September 9, 1927, Alphonse Palazzola was shot and killed by a rival gang. Months later, boss Vito Ginola was shot 37 times to death on December 28, 1927. The remaining members of the Green Ones gang, including John Gianola, went into hiding. The Pillow Gang was the earliest Italian gang in the city, being active since 1910. The gang was led by Pasquale Santino until 1927, when he was murdered. Carmelo Frazina became the new leader, nicknaming it the Pillow Gang because Frazina carried a pillow with him to sit on after he had been shot in the buttocks. Frazina formed an alliance with a splinter group of the Green Ones called the Russo Gang, led by Tony Russo. The 2 gangs battled with the Green Ones until 1928, when the Russo Gang lost too many members and blamed the Pillow Gang for betraying them. In 1931, Carmelo Frazina was murdered, and members of the Pillow Gang continued fighting with the Russo Gang and the Green Ones. The Pillow Gang was taken over by Thomas Buffa, who became boss of the St. Louis Mafia family. The rival gangs continued fighting until the end of Prohibition, when the various mafia factions began functioning as one family. In 1943, Buffa fled the city and was murdered in 1947 in Lodi, California. After Buffa's murder, leadership of the family went to Tony Lopaparo, Frank Coppola, and Ralph Kalica. After Tony Lopaparo's death, Anthony Giordano became boss and declared independence from the Kansas City crime family. In the 1970s, Giordano, along with Detroit mobsters Anthony Joseph Zerilli and Michael Polizzi, attempted to gain control of the Frontier Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. They failed, and all 3 men were convicted of conspiracy. In 1975, Giordano was sent to prison. His nephew Vincenzo Giamanco became the acting boss until Giordano was released in December 1977. On August 29, 1980, Giordano died from cancer in his St. Louis home. Beginning in 1938, Giordano was arrested more than 50 times. His charges included carrying concealed weapons, robbery, holdups, income tax evasion, and counterfeiting tax stamps. In his early years, Giordano wore the wide-brimmed pearl gray hats, expensive suits, and rings favored by many mobsters of that time. He was uncle to Matthew Mike Trupiano, who later became boss. Giordano was also a cousin to the Lacavalists. He was an uncle to St. Louis crime family captain James Giamanco. Giordano was known for his explosive temper. In 1965, he threatened a FBI agent who was trying to ask him questions at his restaurant. On another occasion, in 1970, Giordano grabbed and physically threatened a priest who was trying to retrieve a stolen church vehicle at Giordano's towing company. In the early 1950s, Giordano made several trips to Anzio, Italy, to smuggle heroin into the United States. The U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics observed him on 3 trips but did not gather enough evidence to indict him. In 1956, Giordano was convicted of income tax evasion for his vending machine company and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. When family boss John Vitale retired in 1960, Giordano took over the St. Louis crime family. By the 1960s, he had assumed a lower profile as a blue-collar worker. He and his wife lived in a conservative home in southwest St. Louis. Giordano was often seen in work clothes at his rental properties, performing carpentry or plumbing chores. In February 1968, he was arrested as a suspected gambler during a citywide crackdown on gamblers. In 1972, he was convicted of illegally skimming gambling proceeds from the Aladdin Hotel and Casino in Paradise, Nevada, through the Emprise Corporation with Michael "Big Mike" Polizzi and Anthony "Tony" Zerilli, members of the Detroit Partnership. The St. Louis crime family has avoided local and federal authorities who have been focused on organized crime that inflicts public violence. Anthony Nino Perino served as boss from 1997 to his death on November 3, 2014. The last known underboss was Joseph Camarada. The Hogan Gang was a St. Louis-based criminal organization that sold illegal liquor during Prohibition, in addition to committing labor slugging, voter intimidation, armed robbery, and murder. Although predominantly Irish-American, the Hogan Gang included several Italian and Jewish mobsters amongst their ranks, most notably Max "Big Maxie" Greenberg. They fought a notoriously violent gang war with Egens Rats in the early 1920s. The Hogan Gang got their name from their leader, Edward J. Hogan, Jr. The son of a St. Louis police captain, Hogan was a local saloon keeper who had gone into state politics in the 1910s. Known by the unwanted nickname of Jelly Roll, due to his hefty build, Hogan served in the Missouri State Legislature, where he was known as an effective, garrulous lawmaker. Jelly Roll Hogan was also known to be temperamental. He and a companion assaulted a politician named Ben Neal on the steps of the Missouri Capitol building. With the advent of Prohibition, Hogan and a group of hoodlums that worked under him began selling illegal beer and liquor on a large scale. Jelly Roll was also dubbed a deputy inspector for the State Beverage Department of Missouri, which gave the new gang boss a new position of influence in state and local government. Headquartered out of Hogan's Saloon at Cass and Jefferson Avenues, the Hogan Gang was primarily Irish-American, but had a broad range of ethnicity. Key members included James Hogan, Jelly Roll's younger brother, Humbert Costello, Charles Mercurio, Leo Casey, Abe Goldfeeder, John Kink Connell, and Patrick Scanlon. The gang's top marksman was a dangerous shooter named Luke Kennedy. In addition to bootlegging, some members of the gang occasionally robbed banks and/or the messengers. Members of the Hogan Gang were linked to mail robbery in St. Charles, Missouri, on February 4, 1921, that netted $26,100 in Liberty bonds, and another mail heist in Jefferson City on March 1, 1921, that got $34,400. The fallout from these robberies led to a series of murders that spring, most of which were allegedly perpetrated by Tommy Hayes, who would later make his name as an ace hitman for the Cuckoo Gang. James Hogan led some of his pals on a disastrous St. Louis mail robbery on April 4, 1921, which featured a harried getaway and the discovery that they had stolen 8 pounds of registered mail. A bank messenger named Eris Pillow identified Hogan as one of the men who robbed him. Despite several bribe attempts, including one made by Jelly Roll Hogan himself, Pillow was dead set on testifying. As a result, he was shot to death outside his home on May 9, 1921. Hogan gangsters Leo Casey and Dewey McAuliffe were tried and acquitted of the shooting. Unlike their Irish-American gang counterparts in other Prohibition-era cities, the Hogan Gang got along relatively well with the local mafia factions. They had a close business partnership with the Russo Gang. The Hogan's chief rivals were a fellow Irish gang known as Egens Rats. Jelly Roll Hogan and William Egan had been Democratic political rivals for years, and constantly butted heads with each other in both the Capitol building and the street. While their booze-selling territories encroached upon each other, their two gangs didn't approach all-out warfare until the winter of 1921. The Egan-Hogan War of 1921-23 had its origins with a disgruntled Egan gangster named Max Greenberg, who was accused of cheating Willie Egan out of whiskey shipment. After an unsuccessful attempt on Greenberg's life on March 11, 1921, he defected to the Hogan Gang. It would later be rumored that Max paid 3 members of the Hogan crew $10,000 apiece to kill Willie Egan in front of his saloon at 14th and Franklin on October 31, 1921. Egan gangster William Dint Colbeck reached his boss's side just after the shooting and later claimed that he said the shooters were James Hogan, Luke Kennedy, and John Doyle. Both sides began gunning for each other, often putting innocent bystanders at risk. On December 30, 1921, James Hogan, Luke Kennedy, Abe Goldfeeder, and Hogan Gang attorney Jacob Mackler were ambushed by a carload of Egan gunmen as they left police headquarters in downtown St. Louis. Kennedy was severely wounded in the leg, while a shotgun blast tore Mackler's derby from his head. He was miraculously unhurt. A week later, one of Willie Egan's accused killers, John Doyle, was shot and killed by St. Louis police after a high-speed pursuit through Old North St. Louis. As the war dragged into the new year, the Hogans absorbed most of the casualties. Luke Kennedy, still recuperating from his wounds, was trapped in what is now Wellston on April 17, 1922, and shot to death. Informant Ray Renard later said Kennedy's killers briefly taunted him before they opened fire. Jelly Roll Hogan and his crew retaliated by shooting up Dint Colbeck's Washington Avenue plumbing store, which earned them a counterstrike the next day, when the Egan mob did a drive-by shooting of Hogan's home at 3035 Cass Avenue. The gang boss's parents were forced to dive for cover. By this time, the St. Louis citizenry had become appalled by the open gang violence. A local priest, Monsignor Timothy Dempsey, privately interviewed members of both gangs and persuaded them to agree to make peace in June 1922. Soon after this, several armed Hogan gangsters escorted Max Greenberg to Union Station and put him on a train to New York. The treaty left Egens Rats as the dominant bootlegging mob in St. Louis, but their members continued to antagonize the defeated Hogan Gang. At one point after a bank robbery, Egan gangster Chippy Robinson called the police anonymously and claimed that the Hogans were responsible. Jelly Roll and some of his men were indeed arrested because of the tip. All were cleared of the charges. More seriously, on September 2nd, 1922, Dint Colbeck and 3 of his men stumbled across Hogan gangsters Abe Goldfeeder and Max Gordon in the Bottoms, chased them down Locust Street, and nearly killed them with pistol fire. Gordon lost an eye in the shooting. The peace treaty was finally broken for good on February 21, 1923, when Dint Colbeck and his men ambushed and killed Hogan lawyer Jacob Mackler in Old North St. Louis. Gang shootings swept the city once again. Jelly Roll Hogan's Cass Avenue home was shot up once again on March 22, 1923. Hogan and Humbert Costello traded shots with a carload of Egans while racing up North Grand Boulevard. The Rats' coupe struck and crippled a 12-year-old schoolboy. When his attackers, Isidore Londe and Elmer Runge, were brought before him at the police station, Jelly Roll Hogan was asked if he could identify them. He snarled, "I'll identify them with a shotgun." By now, public outcry had reached a fever pitch. Some quarters openly discussed bringing in the U.S. Marines or National Guard to restore order. It was ultimately the work of Monsignor Tim Dempsey, several police officials, and a St. Louis Star reporter that brought the war to a final end. Both Colbeck and Hogan wrote letters to the people of St. Louis, telling them that their feud was finished. Both letters were published in the Star. Other than an impulsive, unsuccessful attempt on the life of James Hogan in September 1923, the Egan-Hogan War was over. While losers in the gang war, Jelly Roll Hogan and his men ultimately had the last laugh, as Egens Rats would dissolve under a flurry of inter-gang murders and federal mail robbery indictments. Hogan and his men expanded their territory into South St. Louis County and made a fortune by selling illegal beer and liquor for the rest of Prohibition. Hogan himself would later go on to serve 4 terms in the Missouri State Senate. Jelly Roll Hogan died of natural causes on August 11, 1963, at the age of 77. Egens Rats was an American organized crime gang that exercised considerable power in St. Louis, Missouri, from 1890 to 1924. Its 35 years of criminal activity included bootlegging, labor slugging, voter intimidation, armed robbery, and murder. Although predominantly Irish-American, Egens Rats did include a few Italian-Americans and some Jewish immigrants, most notably Max Big Maxie Greenberg. The gang was formed by Thomas Snake Kinney and Tom Egan. It became the dominant criminal organization in St. Louis around the turn of the 20th century, when they became noted as the worst political terrorists in the city. The Rats squeezed out the required number of Democratic votes at the polls. In addition to their election tactics, the Rats also engaged in union busting, armed robbery, and theft from railroads. By the mid-1910s, the gang had entered into bootlegging. By 1921, both Tom and Willie Egan were dead, and leadership of the crew passed to William Dint Colbeck. Egens Rats soon went to war with the rival Hogan Gang, whom they suspected of killing Willie Egan. After defeating the Hogans in a well-publicized war, the Rats turned to armed robberies rather than bootlegging as a chief source of income. In November 1924, 9 key members of the Egan Gang were sentenced to long terms in federal prison for a mail robbery at Staunton, Illinois. While a few lower-ranking members of Egens Rats still operated in St. Louis, they were finished by the fall of 1925. Those members of the gang who escaped imprisonment spread across the country. Some of the ex-Rats, led by Fred Killer Burke, were suspected of being involved in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The gang later made headlines when gang member Leo Vincent Brothers was convicted of the murder of Chicago Tribune reporter Jake Lingle in June 1930. Egens Rats was founded around 1890 by Thomas Snake Kinney and Thomas Egan, 2 street toughs living in the riverfront Cary Patch neighborhood of St. Louis. Recruiting other members from the neighborhood, the Rats started out as pickpockets, burglars, and armed robbers. The gang also aided the Democratic Party political machine by intimidating voters at polling places on Election Day. Kinney used the gang as a stepping stone into politics. He first served as the 4th Ward's delegate into the Missouri House of Delegates and later served in the Missouri State Senate. In contrast, Tom Egan stayed in the old neighborhood and became the main leader of the increasingly powerful Rats. By 1904, Egens Rats was the most powerful street gang in St. Louis. The fabric of the gang were the Democratic political clubs scattered around the city. Most members of the Rats belonged to one club or another. Some Egan-affiliated clubs were the Jolly 5, Cross Keys, and Friendly 10. The Egan Gang's main rival at this time was the violent Bottoms Gang from the 22nd Ward. However, the Bottoms Gang made the mistake of assaulting police officers and were soon forced out of existence. Ruthless killers, the Rats Gang was willing to assassinate anyone, regardless of the consequences. On June 7, 1909, the Rats murdered rival gunman Fred Yellow Kid Morrill in the Four Courts building while he was on trial for killing Egan gangster Sam Young. The Rats got a little taste of their own medicine when John Bad Jack Barry, leader of the Cross Keys Club, was fatally shot in a Northside courtroom on February 24, 1910, by Henry Diederichsen. By 1912, Tom Egan headed an organization of 300 to 400 men. That same year, he gave an astounding interview to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in which he flaunted his power and underworld status. The murder of auto mechanic Fred Hess, in particular, underscored the Rats' blatant gangsterism. At high noon on November 7, 1913, dozens of witnesses saw Deputy Constable Harry Levin shoot and kill Hesse in front of 2647 Olive Street. Fred Hesse was suspected to have snitched on the Rats over a $15,000 railroad swindle. Despite the fact that numerous people saw the unprovoked murder, Levin was acquitted on April 23, 1914. With Snake Kinney's death from tuberculosis, Tom Egan moved the gang into more sophisticated rackets. Correctly suspecting that alcohol consumption would soon be prohibited in the United States, Tom Egan set up a liquor smuggling network in St. Louis. By early 1916, the Egens Rats went to war with the depleted Bottoms Gang. The main cause was disgruntled Egan gangster Harry "Cherries" Dunn, who was angry that Tom Egan did little to help his imprisoned brother John. Dunn shot and killed original Egan Gang member William "Skippy" Rohan inside Tom Egan's saloon on January 8, 1916. Tom's brother Willie successfully argued to spare Dunn's life. Cherries defected to the Bottoms Gang and instigated a full-blown war on August 21, 1916, when he killed Harry Romani, a semi-pro boxer and crook who was allied with the Egan Gang. Willie Egan and 4 of his men confronted Cherries Dunn at the Typo Press Club on September 19, 1916. Walter Costello and Frank Gutter Newman shot and killed him. The war between the Egan and Bottoms gangs claimed almost a dozen lives, including both of Harry Dunn's murderers. Despite the passage of a prohibition law, Tom Egan was unable to reap the full benefits of his liquor smuggling ring. Tom died of Bright's disease on April 20, 1919. After Tom Egan's death in 1919, Egens Rats was taken over by his younger brother, Willie. Unfortunately, Willie wasn't a natural leader like his brother. As a result, younger gang members became restless. While Egan wanted to build up the bootlegging business for long-term profits, the younger members wanted the quicker payoffs of armed robberies. Rebelling against Egan, these youthful gangsters, known as Red Hots, began robbing up banks, armored cars, and messengers with lightning rapidity. By 1921, these disputes worsened when Big Maxie Greenberg, a dissatisfied Egens Rats member, double-crossed Willie Egan over a shipment of whiskey. In retaliation, Egan unsuccessfully attempted to kill Greenberg. At this point, Max defected to a new rival, the Hogan Gang. The Hogan Gang was headed by Egan arch-rival Edward Jelly Roll Hogan, who also served as the Deputy Missouri State Beverage Inspector. On October 31, 1921, Willie Egan was gunned down in front of his Franklin Avenue saloon. The Hogan Gang were considered to be the likely suspects. With the murder of Willie Egan in 1921, William Dint Colbeck took over Egens Rats. A former plumber and World War I infantryman, Colbeck aggressively led Egens Rats against the Hogans. Shootings swept the city, with both gangsters and innocent bystanders being killed on the streets. A primary order of business was tracking down Willie Egan's alleged murderers. According to Dint Colbeck, James Hogan, John Doyle, and Luke Kennedy had been paid $10,000 each to kill Egan. Doyle was shot and killed by St. Louis police on January 6, 1922, while Luke Kennedy was trapped in Wellston on April 17, 1922. Kennedy was shot and killed while begging for his life. Jimmy Hogan spent most of the next year in hiding. In the winter of 1923, the Egan-Hogan War was reignited when the Rats killed Hogan lawyer Jacob Mackler on February 21, 1923. The Rats also shot up Jelly Roll Hogan's house at 3035 Cass Avenue on 2 occasions. By now, public outrage had reached a fever pitch, and people were scrambling to figure out how to get the gangs from shooting each other. By the spring of 1923, the Rats forced the battered Hogan Gang to sign a peace treaty. Now at peace, the Rats commenced a crime wave of robbery and murder in Missouri and Illinois. The gang was ruthless with anyone who crossed them, including their own members. In the midst of it all, Colbeck maintained the gang's rackets. Headquartered at a St. Louis County roadhouse named the Maxwellton Club, the Rats increasingly looked toward their armed robberies for income. It was later estimated that the Rats stole nearly $4.5 million worth in cash and property in a 5-year period. These bank robberies represent only a fraction of the heists Egens Rats pulled off in the 1919 through 1924 window allotted by informant Ray Renard. By far, their most famous caper took place in downtown St. Louis on the morning of April 2, 1923, when they stuck up an armored mail truck after receiving a tip from the Hogan Gang. The Rats took control of the truck and made off with $2.4 million in cash and negotiable bonds. In 1924, Egens Rats would suffer a crushing blow. Fearing for his life, imprisoned gang member Ray Renard started cooperating with federal prosecutors. On November 15, 1924, Colbeck, Louis Red Smith, Steve Ryan, David Chippy Robinson, Oliver Doherty, Frank Hackathall, Charles Red Lanham, Gus Deitmeyer, and Frank Cotton Eppelsheimer were convicted of a Staunton, Illinois mail robbery and sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. With the convictions of Colbeck and his associates, Egens Rats fell apart. The gang members who hadn't gone to prison scattered across the country, wreaking havoc wherever they went. One crew of ex-Rats, led by Fred Killer Burke, committed numerous robberies, kidnappings, and contract murders throughout the American Midwest. This crew allegedly took part in the infamous 1929 St. Valentine's Day massacre of 7 gangsters in Chicago. Burke was involved in the killings of policemen in 1928 and 1929 and died in prison in 1940. Another ex-Rat, Leo Vincent Brothers, was convicted of killing Chicago Tribune reporter Jake Lingle in 1930. 2 other former members, Pete and Thomas Yanni Licavoli, started the River Gang, a large Detroit bootlegging gang that would dominate rackets in both Detroit and Toledo, Ohio. A former Rat named Elmer Macklin would murder Detroit mob boss Chester Lamar in February 1931. Another, Raymond Craneneck Nugent, was involved in the killing of an Ohio policeman in 1928 and vanished in April 1931. By the early 1940s, Colbeck and most of the imprisoned gang members had been set free. They returned to a St. Louis that had changed over the past 20 years. Colbeck and some other gang members tried to muscle their way back into power. Most of them went to work for local mob boss Frank Buster Wortman and eventually retired peacefully. However, Colbeck was machine-gunned to death while driving down a St. Louis street on February 17, 1943. Frank Buster Wortman was an American St. Louis area bootlegger, gambler, criminal gang leader, and a former member of the Shelton Brothers gang during Prohibition. He would eventually succeed the Sheltons and take over St. Louis's gambling operations in southwest Illinois until his death. The son of an East St. Louis fire captain, Wortman spent his early years living in North St. Louis. John Worthman, his grandfather, worked as a proofreader for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and was killed when struck by a streetcar in 1894. Frank turned to crime in his late teens and was arrested for burglary. By 1926, he had begun running errands for the bootlegging Shelton brothers. During the late 1920s and early 1930s, Wortman was a prominent member of the gang, acting as an enforcer in southern Illinois. In 1933, a federal agent was beaten during a raid on one of the Shelton's distilleries, which he had been guarding. He was taken into custody along with his associate, Monroe Blackie Armas. The two were convicted and sentenced to imprisonment in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Wortman served his sentence from 1934 to 1941, gaining an early release. Contrary to sensationalized reporting and stories over the years, he served no time in Alcatraz prison. During Wortman's incarceration, the Federal Prohibition Amendment of 1919 was repealed, which again legalized liquor sales in the U.S. in 1933. Following his release in 1941, Wortman briefly worked as a steamfitter before organizing an army of gunmen whose ranks included Black Charlie Harris, Elmer Sylvester Dutch Dowling, and brothers Monroe and Tony Arms. He then launched a campaign to drive the Sheltons from southern Illinois. Establishing Wortman's Plaza Amusement Company, he soon obtained a virtual monopoly on gambling, specifically slot machines, pinball machines, horse parlors, crap games, and card games. He also established legitimate businesses, including trucking firms and taverns, run by his younger brother Ted. Ted lived on a horse farm on Illinois Route 157 on the north end of Caseyville, about 1 mile from the elder Wortman. By the late 1940s, he had assumed control over illegal gambling in southern Illinois and St. Louis. Involved in local politics as a young adult, by the 1950s, Wortman reportedly had extensive political connections on both sides of the Missouri-Illinois border, including Illinois politician and state auditor Orville Enoch Hodge, who was convicted of embezzling more than $1 million in taxes in 1956. That same year, he assaulted an IRS agent at the Paddock Tavern, which led to his being audited. On February 26, 1962, he was charged with 2 associates of conspiracy to evade taxes, but all 3 were eventually acquitted. In the mid-1950s, Wortman moved from his ranch-style brick home in Collinsville at 2 Crown Drive to a new house in the east end of Collinsville. This new fortress was surrounded by a water-filled moat, with the only access being a narrow bridge. During the 1960s, a black street gang known as the Warlords began moving in on Wortman's territory, and in one incident threw a hand grenade into McCoy's tavern. With the threat of retaliation, members of Wortman's organization were able to intimidate the street gang into backing off. Although his power began to decline in his later years, suffering financial losses from legal battles and closure of gambling operations, he remained in control of southern Illinois gambling until his death on August 3, 1968, at age 63, in Alexian Brothers Hospital due to complications from surgery for laryngeal cancer. Castley's funeral home in Collinsville handled arrangements, and Wortman was buried in Belleville, Illinois, at Mount Carmel Cemetery. Ironically, Frank Wortman lies some 3.6 meters from his chief nemesis, East St. Louis policeman Robert Tree Sweeney, who killed 12 men in the line of duty. Gambling was legalized in East St. Louis after Wortman's death, and the local gambling casino is now the city's largest employer. Max Big Maxie Greenberg was an American bootlegger and organized crime figure in Detroit, Michigan, and later a member of Egens Rats in St. Louis. He oversaw the purchasing of sacramental wine from Orthodox rabbis, then allowed under the Volstead Act, which were sold to bootleggers in the St. Louis, Kansas City, Missouri area during Prohibition. He was also associated with mobsters in this particular method of acquiring illegal liquor, including Waxy Gordon, Meyer Lansky, and Arnold Rothstein. By the early 1910s, Greenberg had joined the Egens Rats and become one of their best members. Max, his brother Morris, and 2 others were suspected in the murder of Sam Mintz on December 5, 1914. It was disclosed that Mintz had informed on the gang in a fire insurance scam they were running. Greenberg managed to avoid being caught. Greenberg was also believed to have played a key role in the Rats' first known bank robbery, that of the Baden Bank on April 10, 1919, during which the robbers took $59,000. Soon after the Baden Bank heist, Greenberg, Ben Milner, and Edward Big Red Powers were sentenced to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary on an interstate theft charge, stemming from the Egan-sponsored robbery of some railroad cars in Danville, Illinois. Egan gang boss William Egan and Missouri State Senator Michael Kinney managed to finagle the 3 men pardons from none other than President Woodrow Wilson himself. Soon after their release, Greenberg and Milner decided to go into the bootlegging racket for themselves. They accomplished this by betraying the very same man who had saved them from prison, Willie Egan. Egan gave Greenberg $2,000 to make a deal with a Mexican smuggler for a load of whiskey. Greenberg, it later turned out, paid the smuggler but kept the whiskey for himself. Egan was furious and demanded that Greenberg reimburse him, but Greenberg claimed the whiskey barge had sunk in the Mississippi River. These bad feelings came to a head in the early morning hours of October 16, 1920, when Greenberg and his friends engaged the rest of the Egens Rats in a huge brawl at Egan's Franklin Avenue saloon. One of the men severely injured was attorney John Sweeney. A month later, Milner would be shot and killed during a running gun battle with the Hogan Gang. After these two incidents, his bootleg business fell into disarray, forcing Greenberg to leave St. Louis for Detroit. In the fall of 1920, he was introduced to Rothstein by Waxy Gordon and asked for a $175,000 loan to purchase speedboats to bring in alcohol from Ontario to Detroit, as well as additional funds for graft payoffs. Rothstein liked the idea, but instead decided to take up rum running to New York, where the demand was the highest in the country. Gordon was allowed to run the operation as a junior partner, while Greenberg, in order not to be cut out entirely, was allowed to take part in the deal under the condition that he mortgage all his personal property to Rothstein and take out an expensive life insurance policy with Rothstein's insurance company. In March 1921, Greenberg returned to St. Louis to lay the groundwork for his new business. Willie Egan gave Greenberg one last chance to account for the missing whiskey. The two, along with John Sweeney and an unidentified man, met at the corner of 6th and Chestnut Streets in downtown St. Louis on March 11, 1921. Greenberg refused to pay once again. As the meet broke up, a lone gunman appeared out of the shadows and started shooting. Sweeney was killed, and Greenberg was shot through the jaw. Despite the severity of his wounds, Greenberg survived. In the wake of this attempt on his life, Greenberg formed an alliance with the rival Hogan Gang. The Egens Rats steadfastly believed that Greenberg was the driving force behind the murder of Egan, who was gunned down in front of his saloon on October 31, 1921. It was said that Greenberg paid the three shooters $10,000 each for the hit. During the ensuing gang war, new Egan boss Dint made hunting Greenberg a top priority. After Monsignor Timothy Dempsey negotiated a truce between the Egan and Hogan gangs in June 1922, several armed Hogan gangsters escorted Max Greenberg onto a New York-bound train. Returning to New York City, Greenberg and Gordon then began leasing motorboats and trucks, which brought in bonded whiskey and scotch from Rothstein's contacts in Canada and the United Kingdom. Their rum-running system, protected by Rothstein's payoffs to certain members of the U.S. Coast Guard, as well as police and local politicians in Long Island and the Jersey Shore, delivered alcohol to high-class hotels in Manhattan among Rothstein's clientele. The bootlegging operation became one of the biggest and most successful in the country for 5 years until September 1925, when Prohibition agents seized one of their ships off Astoria, Long Island. On September 23rd, Greenberg and Gordon were arrested with 11 others and charged with conspiracy to violate the National Prohibition Act. He later went to New Jersey, where in July 1929 he formed a bootlegging cartel with Waxy Gordon and Max Hassel. Greenberg managed Gordon's vast real estate, hotel, and gambling interests, while Gordon's muscle and Hassel's political connections made a formidable alliance, whose operation eventually became the largest producer of real beer in the New York, Philadelphia area. By 1933, the three owned at least 16 or 17 breweries, stretching from Buffalo, Elmira, and Syracuse, New York, to eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, according to the U.S. government. They also controlled smaller unlicensed breweries, known as Cold Water or Wild Cats. Greenberg and his partners began to come under pressure to join the Italian Jewish criminal syndicate, controlled by Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. They also began receiving threats from rival Dutch Schultz. On the afternoon of April 12, 1933, Greenberg and Gordon were scheduled to meet with Hassel at his suite on the 8th floor of the Carteret Hotel in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Between 2:30 and 4 p.m., taxi driver George Hickman told police he drove Greenberg and two other unidentified men from the hotel to the Harrison Brewery. He then drove them back to the Carteret, where he saw Greenberg entered the building. The two men who were with him stayed outside for a few moments before following him inside. Although these men remained unidentified, it was suggested they may have been Greenberg's bodyguards, who were making sure no one followed their boss up to Hassel's hotel room. This was supported by the hotel barber, who said Greenberg waved to him as he entered the hotel at 4:10 p.m. A second theory developed by police suggested that Greenberg never left the hotel at all, as hotel employees claimed his bulletproof sedan was not taken out of the hotel garage that day. Investigators found it unlikely that Greenberg would risk taking a taxi, and without his regular bodyguard, knowing that his life may have been in danger. Shortly after the meeting started, Gordon left his partners and walked down the hall, where he claimed to have entered the room of a young lady, 22-year-old mob prostitute Nancy Presser, with whom he spent the rest of the afternoon. He admitted he had talked to some men after leaving the meeting, but police did not release their names. Lou Parkowitz was also present in the room and left when the participants began discussing serious matters. He was the last to see Greenberg and Hassel alive, as, several minutes later, he returned to the room after hearing gunfire and found both men had been shot to death. Parkowitz claimed that he had passed several men running past him as he hurried back to the room. Entering the room, Parkowitz discovered Hassel's body laying face down near the office doorway, while Greenberg was slumped over a closed roll-top desk, shot 5 times in the chest and head. Frankie Carbo, a gunman for Murder, Inc., was later charged with the murders of Greenberg, Hassel, and Gordon following his arrest in 1935. He spent 6 months in jail before the case was dropped. Joseph Stasi claimed that Meyer Lansky, Abner, Abe Zwillman, and Joe Adonis had ordered the 3 men killed in order to consolidate their control over bootlegging operations in North Jersey. Born in North St. Louis with German and Irish roots, William Kolbeck joined Egens Rats in his late teens. In between his gangster jobs, he trained to work as a plumber. His work in this field resulted in his nickname of Dinty, or Dint, as he was most usually called by associates. After the outbreak of World War I, he joined the United States Army in April 1918 and fought as an infantryman with the 89th Infantry Division in France. Upon his return home in 1919, Kolbeck became Willie Egan's right-hand man in the gang. On October 31, 1921, Willie Egan was shot dead in front of his Franklin Avenue saloon by gunmen in a passing automobile. Kolbeck had been present at the time of the shooting, and Egan reportedly whispered to him the names of the shooters before he died. Now the leader of the gang, Dint, announced to his men that Egan's killers were Jimmy Hogan, John Doyle, and Luke Kennedy. These 3 belonged to the Rats' arch-rivals, the Hogan Gang, which was led by Edward Jelly Roll Hogan, the Missouri State Beverage Inspector. Kolbeck and his men immediately retaliated, and gang warfare engulfed St. Louis. During the first years of Prohibition, the Rats controlled most of the illegal bootlegging in and around St. Louis. They also began to supplement their bootlegging profits with armed robberies that victimized banks, armored cars, and messengers. It was estimated that Egens Rats stole nearly $4 million over a 5-year period. Kolbeck was ruthless with anyone who got in the gang's way, including its own members. Dint Kolbeck was the most powerful gangster in St. Louis during the early 1920s. He and his men were headquartered at the Maxwellton Club in North St. Louis County, and Kolbeck often dispensed bribes, illegal booze, or other favors from his roost. Dint also served as the sergeant-at-arms of the St. Louis Democratic City Committee, giving him a political base inside the city government. While Kolbeck was shot and wounded by the Hogan Gang during the gang war, he successfully led his crew against their rivals until a peace treaty was brokered in June 1922 by Monsignor Timothy Dempsey. While Dint did not usually accompany his men on jobs, he had no qualms about getting his hands dirty. Having survived years on the streets and combat on the Western Front, Kolbeck was fearless under fire and an expert shot. His weapon of choice was the BR. The Hogan Gang war reignited when Kolbeck and 5 of his men assassinated Hogan Gang lawyer Jacob Mackler on February 21, 1923. Shootings again rocked the city of St. Louis. By Easter Sunday, 1923, both Dint and Jelly Roll Hogan wrote letters to the citizens of St. Louis, telling them that the war was finally finished once and for all. Both notes were published in the St. Louis Star. By 1924, Kolbeck and the Rats were at the height of their power, but trouble was coming fast. Cliques had developed in the gang, and Kolbeck surrounded himself with his 4 core gunmen: bodyguard Louis Red Smith, Steve Ryan, Oliver Doherty, and sharpshooter David Chippy Robinson. A handful of rats either fled town or ran afoul of Dint Kolbeck. In one instance of intra-gang turmoil, Dint and his 4 top men executed disgruntled Egan gang member Eddie Linehan at the Maxwellton Club on February 13, 1924. By this time, the law was closing in as well. Kolbeck and his top henchmen went on trial for 2 1923 mail robberies, one of which netted the gang nearly $2.4 million US in cash and negotiable bonds. In order to pay his crew's mounting legal fees, Dint led some of the boys on the robbery of the Granite City National Bank on April 25, 1924, netting $63,000. Kolbeck was also suspected of ordering an assassination attempt on his longtime benefactor and associate, Missouri State Senator Michael Kinney, on June 3, 1924. Kinney survived his wounds, and no one was charged in his shooting. On the strength of the testimony of Egan gangster Ray Renard, Kolbeck and 8 of his men were convicted on November 15, 1924, and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. While in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, one of his cellmates was Chicago gang boss Al Capone, who assisted him in his work with the Catholic chaplain. Legend has it, the two hit it off so well, they planned to go into business together once they were both paroled. These plans were foiled by Capone's transfer to Alcatraz in 1934. Paroled in November 1940, Kolbeck declared he was going to work as a master plumber and stay out of trouble. Nevertheless, Kolbeck and his old associates were rumored to be trying to muscle their way back into the St. Louis underworld. On February 17, 1943, Dint Kolbeck was found machine-gunned to death in his car at the corner of 9th and Destrand Streets in St. Louis. The exact motive for his murder was unclear. He might have been killed by crime bosses wanting to eliminate a potential rival or by someone nursing a grudge. No one was ever charged in Kolbeck's murder. The Bottoms Gang was an American street gang in St. Louis, Missouri during the early 20th century. Their main criminal activities included voter intimidation, armed robbery, assault, illegal lottery, and murder. The gang's members were primarily Irish American, with a handful of German and Missouri Creole members. The Bottoms Gang had a meteoric rise and fall in St. Louis's underworld. They feuded with the larger Egens Rats gang and became notorious for going out of their way to attack members of the St. Louis Police Department. They made up for their lack of numbers with extreme violence. Crippled by arrests and murders, the Bottoms Gang had ceased to exist by the time America entered World War I. The gang had their roots in the political gangs that infested St. Louis city wards at the beginning of the 20th century. One of the most powerful was headed by John Bad Jack Williams, a former detective turned gangster who acted as an underworld liaison for Democratic political boss Colonel Ed Butler. Bad Jack Williams's crew was headquartered at a saloon at the corner of 19th and Chestnut Streets in a neighborhood of rickety tenements, saloons, brothels, and gambling dens. This rough district ran north of Union Station to about Cass Avenue. At a slightly lower elevation than the surrounding area, it was alternately known as the Badlands or the Bottoms. It was from this latter nickname that the future Bottoms Gang would obtain its moniker. By 1904, Missouri Attorney General and future Governor Joseph Folk had smashed the Butler machine and with it the Williams Gang. Most of its members were either imprisoned or killed. One of the only survivors of Bad Jack Williams's inner circle was 25-year-old Frank Hussey, a rarity as one of the city's only gangsters to have attended college. He majored in political science and business at St. Louis University. That year, Hussey had been elected to the St. Louis House of Delegates at the Democratic Party in the 22nd Ward. Not unlike other St. Louis political bosses, he began using local street toughs to help enforce his will. One of his key associates was his half-brother Lawrence Lawler Daley, who was active in local politics as well. Daley served as a member of both the Missouri State and St. Louis City Democratic Committees. 1. Most street-level members of the Bottoms Gang grew up in the 22nd Ward. Although only 20 years old, their leader, Anthony Foley, was known as one of the most feared street fighters in the Bottoms. Some of his friends included Edward Red McAuliffe, Richard McLaughlin, Beverly Brown, Cornelius Connie Sullivan, Wesley Red Simons, John Cotty, and the three Carroll brothers, Pete, Eddie, and John. These young men inaugurated a reign of terror on the streets on the 22nd starting in 1905. Crimes like burglary, assault, armed robbery, gang rape, and murder were legion. While his men made a name of themselves on the street, Frank Hussey was becoming a force to be reckoned with in the political spectrum. During one 1906 speech at the House of Delegates, Hussey approached brewing magnate August Busch in order to convince him to stop holding up the passage of a bill. After giving a long, threatening speech to the delegates, police finally had to drag Frank Hussey out of the place. Busch was said to have admired his pluck. Bottoms Gang also had substantial profits coming in from the numbers game, an illegal lottery prevalent in the black neighborhoods adjoining the Bottoms. Lawler, Daley controlled this racket with an iron fist and oversaw the two main wheels, Little Joe and Mobile. Daley's operation was headquartered at the Hibernia Literary and Social Club at 2320 Olive Street, which also served as a hangout for the Bottoms Gang members. The number one enemy of the Bottoms Gang was the larger, more powerful Egens Rats gang. Frank Hussey had hated its leaders, Thomas Snake Kinney and Tom Egan, for years. Hussey had been shot and nearly killed in a street fight with members of the Rats, then named the Kinney Gang, in November 1900. Frank's gunshot wound to the abdomen had never healed properly and would occasionally reopen and bleed. It was the ultimate goal of Hussey and Lawler Daley to unseat the Kinney-Egan Combine as the dominant Democratic force in the city of St. Louis. The Bottoms Gang marched into the 15th Ward and openly confronted the Rats during the Democratic primary day of October 6, 1906. Members of both gangs brawled with each other at the polls all day. While Frank Hussey hated the Egan Gang, Tony Foley was waging war against the St. Louis Police Department. He and his friends had grown up mistrusting the police, and Foley's hatred for them tripled after his kid brother Tim was shot dead while burglarizing a newsstand in December 1906. Tony was convinced that the cops had let Tim Foley's killer escape justice. On the night of February 10, 1907, Tony and several of his friends attacked and nearly killed Patrolman Patrick Stapleton, near the corner of 23rd and Franklin Streets. Foley was later interviewed by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and claimed that Patrolman Stapleton was a liar and a four-flusher. Tony Foley would eventually be convicted of assault and sent to prison. By the beginning of 1907, Tom Egan began using his contacts within the police force to turn up the heat on the rival Bottoms Gang. Their policy racket had been subjected to a series of raids in the last weeks of 1906. On the night of January 15, 1907, members of both gangs met in a peace conference at the Jolly Five Club, located at 1505 Morgan Street. After the meeting concluded, Tom Egan shot and mortally wounded an old enemy of his, Willie Gagel. Several weeks later, on March 2nd, After police pressure from the Gagel murder and Stapleton assault died down, the Bottoms gang met at 20 North 11th Street to draw up a new political club charter. Two members of the crew got into a drunken fight, and Rex McDonald ended up shot to death. In the ensuing months, the Bottoms gang became a runaway freight train. Often fueled by alcohol and/or cocaine, the boys attacked, robbed, and pillaged across the 22nd Ward. Frank Hussey, ostensibly a politician, often personally led his men into action. Residents usually kept their mouths shut out of fear. City policemen who tried to stop them were usually beaten senseless by the swarms of gangsters. One such incident, in the early morning hours of August 2, 1907, resulted in a running gun battle across the Badlands between the gangsters and the police. One of the pursuing officers and an innocent bystander were wounded in the gunplay. Perhaps the most reckless deed attributed to the Bottoms gang occurred on the morning of April 14, 1908. Eddie Carroll led a half-dozen of their number to the police's Jefferson Club at dawn. Finding no cops on the premises, the boys broke all the building's windows. At 9 o'clock, the Bottoms gangsters pulled up to St. Louis City Hall's Market Street entrance in an expensive coach. They charged into the building, shouting obscenities while brandishing revolvers and cracking snake whips at passerby. They headed for the office of Lewis Marks, superintendent of the water tap and motor department. Marks had recently fired Carroll from his cushy job. After seeing that their quarry was gone, Eddie Carroll snarled, "The guy what we was looking for ain't here." The gangsters were arrested soon after while refueling at a nearby saloon. Due to police pressure, they had relocated their headquarters to a converted church, now named the West End Athletic Club at 22nd and Washington Streets. On the night of January 17, 1909, the place was packed with members of the gang drinking and singing. Patrolman John Hutton had told them several times to keep the noise down, which led to a confrontation where several members of the gang attempted to waylay and shoot him. Connie Sullivan shot Patrolman Hutton twice during the struggle. While Hutton survived his wounds, he was left permanently disabled. The state of Missouri intervened at this point, and several members of the gang were arrested and sent to prison, including Connie Sullivan. Frank Hussey, who had been on the scene that night, fled to Springfield, Illinois. He, Bev Brown, and Charles Naughton were arrested and extradited a short time later. While Hussey escaped criminal charges from the shooting of Patrolman John Hutton, his political career was essentially finished. Frank Hussey would die suddenly on August 3, 1911, from a series of hemorrhages. The Bottoms gang never recovered from the convictions of 1909. They diminished to a minor street gang in comparison to Egens Rats. Older members, like Tony Foley and Bev Brown, retired from street rackets and went into the saloon business. A splinter group of the Bottoms gang became known as the Nixie Fighters because of their penchant for fighting police officers. The two main leaders of this group, Edward Devine and Charles von der Ahe, were murdered by Egan gunmen in the fall of 1911. The remaining members of the Bottoms gang were either locked up, killed, or cast their lots with other criminal organizations. By 1913, what was left of the crew was led by Wesley "Red" Simons. He and others used Tony Foley's saloon at 23rd and Olive Streets as a base of operations. It was here that Red Simons shot and killed fellow gangster Emmett Carroll on March 31, 1913, in a fight over a woman. A bartender and sneak thief named Henry Zhang insisted on testifying against Simons despite a slew of threats against his life. The day of Red Simons' trial, March 2, 1914, the gang boss was accorded a special detail of detectives to protect him at the municipal courts building. There had been a recent rash of gang-related murders at St. Louis courthouses. The star witness, Henry Zhang, had no official protection other than a .38 revolver hidden on his person. Both men ran into each other in James Mooney's saloon at 1233 Chestnut Street during the court's lunch break that day. Zhang later claimed that Simons had threatened him and that he shot him to death in self-defense. The coroner's jury agreed, as Henry Zhang was not charged with killing Red Simons. In the summer of 1916, what was left of the old Bottoms gang gathered at Charles Cap Troll's Lid Club, after hours drinking establishment, the Typo Press Club in the rear of 712 Pine Street. It was here that they became embroiled in a final gang war with their old nemesis, Egens Rats. The roots of this strife lay with Egan gunman named Harry Cherries Dunn, who blamed gang boss Tom Egan for letting his brother John go to an Illinois prison with little or no assistance. Cherries Dunn was a good friend of the current leader of the Bottoms gang, Edward Schonborn. After killing a few members of the Egan mob, Harry Dunn took refuge at the Typo Press. 4 members of the Rats, led by Willie Egan himself, tracked down Dunn and killed him there on September 19, 1916. Eddie Schonborn was shot dead 3 weeks later at the old saloon at 1233 Chestnut Street, now owned by Bev Brown. A tit-for-tat war ensued throughout the rest of the fall and into 1917. John Pudgy Dunn was released from prison and swore to kill every man connected with his brother's death. With the help of Bottoms gangster Dave Creeley, Dunn succeeded in killing one of the triggermen, Frank Gutter Newman, on June 8, 1917. While all of Harry Dunn's murderers would indeed die violent deaths, the Bottoms gang had evaporated by the end of the summer of 1917. A handful of the surviving members had relocated to the Soulard district, where they fell in with a local mob known as the Chouteau Avenue Gang. Over the fullness of time, this crew would evolve into the Cuckoo Gang. Most street-level members of the Bottoms gang ended up either dead or serving long prison sentences. Very few of them had long-term success in the underworld. Tony Foley would eventually become a well-known St. Louis gambling figure, running several roadhouse casinos in St. Louis County. He would die in Nevada of natural causes in 1962. Beverly Brown owned and operated the first racing wire service for the city of St. Louis. While his business was forcibly seized by gangster Frank Buster Wertman in later years, he died a wealthy man in July 1949. Lawrence Lawler Daley remained active in St. Louis city politics until his death in 1936. William Skippy Rohan was a St. Louis gangster and an original member of Egens Rats. Born as William J. Rohan, Rohan grew up in North St. Louis's Carey Patch neighborhood. As a young man, he found his way into many of the street gangs inhabiting his district. Skippy was known as a tough street fighter with nerves of steel. He didn't hesitate to attack police officers who attempted to stop him from committing crimes. Despite having a prominent chipped front tooth, he was considered a ladies' man. People often commented on his half-lidded eyelids, which gave him a perpetually sleepy expression. No matter how many times he was arrested and thrown in the city workhouse, Skippy was known as the wildest crook in the Carey Patch. In 1892, 2 St. Louis detectives caught Rohan in a stick-up. Skippy drew his revolver and shot one before he could react. The other detective was pistol-whipped so hard his skull was fractured. He was only caught when a uniformed patrolman happened upon the scene and shot Skippy in the leg. By 1896, Rohan was associated with the Ashley Street Gang, the embryonic Egens Rats. Most of the Ashley Street boys were just sneak thieves at this time, and were awed to be hooked up with a notorious crook like Skippy Rohan, who took a primary position in the fledgling gang. He grew especially close to gangster Tom Egan. On June 16, 1897, Skippy was accused of shooting and killing a saloonkeeper named Casper Beamfor during a robbery gone bad. Him and his pals had been on a crime spree that week, and the police set out to find the young thug. Skippy took refuge in the Rookery, a large tenement at 15th and O'Fallon Streets that was crowded with refugees, criminals, and garbage. The cops finally surprised him in the alley behind 1218 15th Street. Skippy fought for his life, gouging, swinging, and biting. Even his girlfriend, Alice Parsons, tried to fight the police. He was finally pistol-whipped unconscious and hauled off to jail. His sister Catherine was married to a low-level member of the Ashley Street gang named Carl Lorman, who idolized his wild brother-in-law. While Skippy was locked up in the city jail, he was convinced that Lorman was responsible for his arrest. On August 9, 1897, Carl Lorman was lured to a meeting at Snake Kinney's saloon at 2nd and Carr with Tom Egan and John Guinea Mac McAuliffe. As he left, Lorman was stabbed to death at the corner of 6th and Carr. Despite the murder of the suspected snitch, Skippy Rohan made plans to avoid the hangman's noose on his own. On August 30, 1897, Rohan escaped from the St. Louis workhouse along with Buck O'Malley and Sport Heffernan. Rohan would later claim he bribed a jailer to gain access to materials that led to his break. After robbing a local saloon for funds, he and his fellow escapees fled to Chicago, where they were recaptured 4 months later. Skippy Rohan was ultimately acquitted of the murder of Casper Beamfor on May 22, 1898. While he was sent to prison on unrelated robbery charges, Rohan declared that he had found the Lord and reformed. Over the next decade, Skippy Rohan would be in and out of prisons across the United States. He is known to have served time in New York's Sing Sing prison. By 1914, Rohan had returned to his hometown of St. Louis, a broken-down old thief. Years of hard living and prison time had taken their toll, and Skippy Rohan truly aspired to go straight. Rohan married and obtained a job as a shoe worker. While he was away, his old gang, the Egens Rats, had mushroomed into the most powerful criminal organization in the state of Missouri. His old pal, Tom Egan, was now looked upon as the crime boss of St. Louis. While Skippy frequently joined Egan for drinks at his saloon at Broadway and Carr Streets, Rohan appears to have been serious about going legit. His life, however, would be changed by a chance encounter. As a condition of his parole, Skippy Rohan would check in with St. Louis detectives at their headquarters at the corner of 12th and Clark Streets. As he left one of these sessions in December of 1915, Rohan ran into Egan gangster Harry "Cherries" Dunn, who mumbled a greeting and hurried away. It turned out that Dunn had visited the cops in order to offer to snitch on his fellow gangmates in order to get his brother John sprung from an Illinois prison. As a result of this chance encounter, Cherries Dunn became paranoid that Tom Egan would find out about his disloyalty and kill him. As a result, Dunn was involved in at least 2 murders that month. It was later determined that his high-strung mental state resulted in him panicking and shooting in both cases. Skippy Rohan, now trying to live a normal life, was unfortunately oblivious to all this. On the evening of January 7, 1916, Skippy Rohan and his friend August Hartman attended a meeting for the shoemakers' union they belonged to. Afterwards, Rohan suggested they go have a few drinks in the old neighborhood. At 12:30 that morning, the two were in Tom Egan's saloon at Broadway and Carr. Even though it was a Friday night, the saloon was nearly empty. Egan's joint was a well-known gangster roost. The pair stood at the bar talking with bartender John Laker when Cherries Dunn suddenly barged in. Dunn told Laker to set the house up with drinks, except for Rohan. Skippy growled, "What's the matter with me?" To which Dunn sneered, "Go on, you snitch!" Rohan stepped away from the bar, but before he could speak, Dunn shot him squarely on the nose. Another bullet struck Rohan in the heart before he collapsed to the floor. While police suspected that Cherries Dunn had killed Skippy Rohan, they didn't charge him. It was later surmised that Dunn killed Rohan to keep him from revealing that he had been seen at the St. Louis police headquarters. Either way, Dunn was finished in the Egens Rats to begin with. It was a long-standing edict that no crimes were to be committed on the premises of Tom Egan's saloon. After killing a man and longtime friend of the boss, Dunn was marked for death. Willie Egan managed to save Dunn's life for the time being, until 2 of his men shot Cherries to death in a Pine Street Lid Club 9 months later.
You're watching the Everything Network.
Charles Birger was born to a Jewish family in the Russian Empire and emigrated to the United States as a child with his parents. Him and his family settled in St. Louis, where at age 8, Charlie got a job as a newsboy at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper. Later, he moved to the O'Fallon, Missouri area, where he started work in a pool room. On July 5, 1901, Birger enlisted in the United States Army and was assigned to Company G of the newly formed 13th Cavalry Regiment, then stationed in South Dakota. He was described as a good soldier and was honorably discharged on July 4, 1904, at Fort Meade, South Dakota. When he left the Army, he became a cowboy. However, he eventually returned to Illinois, where he met his first wife, Edna, to whom a daughter was born. He went on to marry multiple times, being married to Beatrice Bainbridge of Harrisburg, Illinois, in 1921. Later became a miner in the quickly expanding coal mining community of Harrisburg, later to become a keeper at one of the local saloons. Following World War I, in 1919, the United States adopted national prohibition, which banned the sale, manufacture, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. Birger recognized this as a business opportunity, and in 1920, he joined forces with the Shelton brothers. He initially based his operation in Harrisburg, southern Illinois. The law authorities in Saline County eventually persuaded him to leave, and he built a fortified speakeasy called Shady Rest just across the line in Williamson County. Shady Rest stood next to Old Highway 13, halfway between Harrisburg and Marion. A small barbecue stand just off the highway served as the guard shack. Charlie Birger and the Shelton Brothers gang fought for control of the coal fields of southern Illinois, but their attention was diverted by a common enemy. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan supported national prohibition. Alcohol was regarded as an un-American vice practiced by white ethnic immigrants, many of whom were Roman Catholics and other religions. Many of these immigrants worked in the coal mines of southern Illinois, living mainly in very small towns while maintaining a very strong ethnic pride. Alcohol was a part of their life, and bootlegging came naturally to them. In the spring of 1923, the Klan began organizing in Williamson County, holding meetings attended by more than 5,000 people. The Klan drew its support from both the farming community and people in the larger towns, the latter mainly of Scotch-Irish origin and belonging to the Baptist and other traditional Protestant churches. The Klan soon found a charismatic leader in Seth Glenn Young, a 58-year-old former federal law enforcement officer. Large mobs began going door to door, forcibly searching houses for alcohol. If alcohol was found, the occupants were taken to Klan prisons. Federal authorities apparently had deputized the Klansmen to aid in the enforcement of prohibition. Many elected public officials of Williamson County were viewed as being allies of the bootleggers, perhaps correctly. These elected public officials were driven from office and replaced by Klan members. The Illinois state government was either unable or unwilling to reestablish lawful authority. On January 24, 1925, a shot was fired in the street in Herrin, Illinois. Deputy Sheriff Ora Thomas responded and walked into a cigar store where he saw Klan leader Young. Thomas drew his pistol and shot Young twice. Young was able to shoot Thomas once before falling to the floor. Two of Young's companions, fellow Klansmen Edward Forbes and Omer Warren, joined in the melee, and all 4 men were fatally wounded. The Klan held a public funeral for Young that was attended by more than 15,000 people. In April 1926, Charlie Birger and the Shelton brothers joined forces to attack the remaining Klan leaders in Herrin, using Tommy guns and shotguns. The police were called repeatedly, but chose not to respond. 4 Klansmen and 2 anti-Klansmen were killed in a shootout. The Klan buried its dead, and the coroner ruled that their deaths were homicides by parties unknown. Although the Klan's losses were not large, the Herrin attack broke the back of the local KKK. Lawfully elected local officials returned to their offices, and Birger and the Shelton brothers went back into business. Birger regarded Harrisburg as his hometown. When a small shop was robbed, he publicly made good the owner's losses, and the suspected thief was found shot dead a few days later. This incident coincided with the beginning of his war with the Shelton brothers' gang, fought over control of bootlegging in the area. By October 1926, the Birger and Shelton gangs were in open conflict. Both gangs built tanks, trucks converted into makeshift armored vehicles from which they could shoot. The Shelton gang even tried to bomb Shady Rest from the air. The dynamite they dropped missed. Many were killed during the war, and sometimes it was not clear which side they were on. 3 deaths became important in ending Birger's own life. Joseph Adams was the mayor of West City, Illinois, a village near Benton. Birger learned that the Shelton's tank was in Joe Adams' garage for repairs and demanded the tank. When Adams failed to surrender it, Birger's men orchestrated a drive-by bombing, destroying Adams' front porch. In December 1926, 2 men, Harry and Elmo Thomason, appeared at Joe Adams' house, announcing that they had a letter from Carl Shelton. They handed a letter to Adams, and as he started to read it, they drew their pistols and shot him dead. The following month, the Shady Rest was destroyed by a series of large explosions and an ensuing fire. 4 bodies, one a woman's, were found in the ruins, charred beyond recognition. This was widely seen as a decisive blow struck by the Sheltons. At about the same time, Illinois State Trooper Laurie Price and his wife went missing. Price was widely believed to be associated with the Birger gang. He had been running a scam in which Birger stole cars and hid them until a reward was offered. Then the trooper pretended to find the cars and split the reward with Birger. In June 1927, Birger was arrested on a charge of ordering the contract killing of Mayor Joseph Adams. Birger allowed himself to be taken into custody without a fight. He had been arrested many times and had always been released a few days later. He may not have realized that the trial was to take place in Franklin County, which his political allies did not control. Birger and the 2 men who did the killing were convicted. However, only Birger was sentenced to hang. Birger objected that it was unfair he should receive the death penalty, while the confessed trigger man was sentenced only to prison in return for his cooperation with investigators. Nevertheless, Birger was hanged for the murder of Adams on April 19, 1928, at the Franklin County Jail in Benton. At Birger's request, he was accompanied to the gallows by a rabbi and wore a black hood rather than a white one, since he did not want to be mistaken for a Klansman. Charlie Birger was the second to last man to be executed in a public hanging in Illinois. Charles Shader was hanged 6 months later on October 10, 1928. Birger shook hands with the hangman, Philip Hanna, the humane hangman, and his final words were, "It's a beautiful world." Local Southern Illinois legend attests that Birger said, "It's a beautiful day," in defiance, while the newspapers reported the remorseful word, "It's a beautiful world."
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.